Latin American leaders say it's time for a debate on alternatives to the war on drugs that's left tens of thousands dead. Though the US president says that discussion is important, legalization is not an option. What are the options? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. Over the last 4 decades, the United States has spent billions of dollars promoting and supporting a military battle against drug cartels across the region. But global demand for illicit drugs has only increased, and the violence related to the drug trade has worsened. More than 50,000 people were killed in the last 5 years in Mexico alone. And the influence of the drug cartels has grown across Central America. Now, a demand for alternative policies to the war on drugs has come from an unlikely source, including Guatemala's President Otto Perez Molina and Colombia's President Juan Manuel Santos, one a former general, the other a former defense minister. When the leaders brought up the issue for debate during the Summit of the Americas on Saturday, the US president said Americans understand the toll of narco-trafficking on Central and South America and the Caribbean. But he insisted legalization is not the answer. He also announced the US would provide more than $130 million to Central American countries to, quote, support the regional security strategy. Nonetheless, as Al Jazeera's Latin America editor Lucia Newman reports, despite US resistance to legalization, Saturday's debate in Colombia is still seen as a step forward.
In 1990, right here in Cartagena, Colombia, former U.S. President George Bush held what was considered the world's first drug summit, along with his peers from Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru. It was called to declare an all-out war against drug trafficking. The idea was that lots of law enforcement, eradicating drug crops, and of course lots of interdiction would do the trick, along with reducing the appetite for drugs in the United States. 22 years later, there seems to be consensus that that drug war has not worked. That's why the agreement reached here in Cartagena at the Summit of the Americas is significant. There is an agreement that includes the United States to re-examine what is happening to the drug war and not to exclude any options, including the study of what would happen if drugs were legalized. This was a proposal that was put on the table by the president of a small country, Guatemala, President Otto Perez, with whom I spoke to at length. He says that the drug war so far has been a total failure and that it is time to look at all options, to have a serious study of what would happen if drugs were legalized as a way of crippling the drug cartels that are spreading so much corruption and death throughout so much of Latin America. Even the president of Colombia, the country that has received billions of dollars in aid to combat drug trafficking, agrees that all options must be examined, all alternatives. There is certainly no consensus about the wisdom of legalizing drugs, totally or partially. The United States, Canada, and many other countries in this region are totally opposed to it. But at least the subject is now on the table, and the Organization of American States has been entrusted now with starting a new and serious study to look for new ways to deal with a very old problem. For Inside Story, I'm Lucia Newman in Cartagena de Indias, Colombia.
So are leaders in the Americas ready for an honest debate about drug policies? To discuss that, we're joined from Bogotá by Laura Gil. She's a columnist for the Colombian newspaper El Tiempo. She's also a former consultant to the Organization of the American States. Here in the studio, we're joined by Stephen Dudley, the co-director of Insight Crime, a think tank which focuses on crime and security in the Americas, and by Jose Cardenas, a former official under President George W. Bush. Stephen Dudley, then. How significant was it that this topic was discussed both publicly and privately over the weekend at the Summit of the Americas?
I think it was very significant. I think that we're looking at a change in the way that these leaders approach this issue, both publicly and privately, and we're looking at it for a number of reasons. Probably the most important of which is that they're more independent. They're more independent economically. They do more trade amongst their neighbors than they did before. They have less dependence on the United States economies, and they're more independent for a financial aid perspective. So they're able to manage their own monies, and they know that they face this problem, and many times face this problem alone. So given that they have this greater independence, they're saying we need to take this on independently as well.
Lara Gill, then, I mean, are we witnessing this progression from, before it was just activists who spoke about this, then it was former presidents who spoke about looking at other options in the drug war. Now, sitting presidents, what do you make of this progression?
Well, I think this is a step forward, but this is not sufficient. This is not enough. We have to move forward faster. The drug wars has completely overwhelmed the capacity of Latin American states, and we have to think seriously about institutional mechanisms for the regulation of the market.
And I guess the point is, though, it's not simply, though, that sitting presidents are speaking about this. It's which presidents are speaking. It's not just any president, but the Colombian president or the Guatemalan president. Actually, here's how the Colombian president framed his call for more debate over the weekend. It was quite interesting at the Summit of the Americas.
La drogadicción en la inmensa mayoría de los países es un
Drug addiction in the vast majority of countries is a very serious public health problem. Drug trafficking continues to be the principal financier of violence and terrorism. Colombia and many other countries in the region believe it is necessary to begin a discussion and analysis of this issue without judgment and without dogmas, and look at the different scenarios and the possible alternatives to confronting this challenge with the greatest effectiveness.
Jose Cardenas, I mean, Juan Manuel Santos, they're talking about no judgments or dogma, but nonetheless, the implication is that Plan Colombia hasn't worked. That's one of the reasons why you need this debate now. The narrative, certainly in Washington, or indeed in the mainstream media in the U.S., is Plan Colombia was a great success. But we're hearing from the region it hasn't been a great success, and now we do need a fundamental change. Would you agree with that?
Well, I agree. I hold to the opinion that Plan Colombia did achieve significant advances in spreading security in Colombia. The question is the cost. I think that's what President Santos is questioning right now, whether it was worth the cost.
But doesn't 95% of cocaine sold in the U.S. still come from Colombia, and didn't the violence just spread elsewhere anyway? I mean,
well, I
it's not
think
just the financial cost.
Exactly, and there's tremendous human cost for people caught in the crossfire. I think that what you see today is Colombia made it through this past decade at a tremendous cost. What we are seeing in countries like Central America is they don't have the capacity to replicate many of the same sacrifices and investment into pushing back on the drug cartels and the encroachments and the corruption. And I think that is what we are seeing mostly driving this from the Central Americans.
Lara Gill, would you accept that characterization then of Plan Colombia, that Juan Manuel Santos is only really speaking out because he's seen the spreading of the violence, but as far as Colombia itself is concerned, Plan Colombia did the trick? Is that something you'd agree with?
I think Colombia has made large strides in the drug wars, but in the war on drugs. But I think the Colombian leadership in this topic is lukewarm. I think for a country that has put so many lives, that has lived through so many years of war, that's still living through still a very serious security situation, I think there's much more to do. I have to say that the question of the war on drugs was put on the agenda by Central American countries. Colombia did not want this in the agenda. When the Central Americans made it clear that there was no question of taking it out, Colombia had to run with the ball. So I don't see a lot of leadership coming from here. You haven't shown the clips of Juan Manuel Santos saying previous to the meeting, we are willing to talk about legalization, but we don't want to lead the issue. We don't want to lead the issue because we have this black label within the international community about this image put forward of a Colombian made of basically drug dealers. And now that our image is much more positive, we don't think we should be leading this talk.
But so, nonetheless, I mean, at least that talk is occurring.
I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, so Stephen Dudley then, I mean, it's not just Juan Manuel Santos then who's at least broaching the subject. When you got Felipe Calderon of Mexico talking about market alternatives, might there be something more than just rhetoric, though, flowing from those sorts of governments who once were so squarely behind the US's militarization of this drug issue?
I think there's a couple issues, and a little bit following up on what Lauda is saying. One is priorities. There are different priorities. The United States has certain priorities that leads countries to take certain strategies that many of these countries now deem as not working, as failing. Some countries say they work partially. Certainly they've worked to dismantle some organizations, but they have not worked to lower the levels of violence, which is the main concern of these countries. At the heart of all this, the subtext of all this talk is we are putting the dead. That's what the Latin American countries are saying. We're putting down the dead, and yes, we are getting some money for doing this, but we need to change this policy. This policy is not doing what we need it to do in terms of lowering the amount of violence.
But what happened there in the last few months even? I mean, certainly even the Costa Rican president seemed quite hostile to this kind of discussion just last year when the UN Global Commission drug policy report came out. Chinchilla was pretty hostile to it. And yet even she now is suddenly saying, okay, let's have this discussion. Is it simply, I mean, has something changed in the last few months even then in this debate, do you think?
Well, I think, frankly, I don't want to appear partisan here, but I do believe that that the Obama administration has not been as active on this front as it should be. And I think that that has created a vacuum that has allowed this movement, this surge in the willingness of regional leaders to speak out. It's partly due, in my opinion, to a lack of focus from Washington on identifying and expressing solidarity with these countries that are going through these very hard times.
And of course, there's a lot of criticism just generally with the Obama administration in Latin America. Lara Gill, yes.
Yes, I very much agree with what Stephen was saying. Mr. Obama gave a number of interviews to Colombian media before the summit in Cartagena, and he was very clear. There is no move forward on the question on drugs for the United States. So when Shihab was talking about honest debate, I have questions about honest debate. I'm not sure this may not be simply a way to postpone the honest debate, the mandate that the Organization of American States received by the countries in the past few days. I think we need to do things faster. We need to do things faster, and this talk about moving only on decriminalization of consumption will not solve the problems the Latin American states are facing. We are the producers. Decriminalizing consumption will do nothing for us.
All right, well, let's take a look at what is being called for specifically. This is one of the more surprising aspects, again, as to who is leading this debate. And as you say, it's Central America, and in particular the Guatemalan president, once known as a strong man, pretty controversial record in the past, campaigned in his election, actually, for cracking down on the drug cartels. Our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman, spoke to the Guatemalan president, Otto Perez Molina. Let's see some of the specifics as to what he's asking for.
Here in Colombia, 1 kilo of cocaine costs up to $1,200. When it gets to Guatemala, it costs up to $10,500. And by the time that same kilo gets to the north of the United States, it can cost as much as $160,000. We would expect that prices would go down and be regulated. But of course, that does not mean that you can buy drugs on every corner. No, they would be regulated. It's a process in which nations would have to reach an agreement to manage this. But the important thing is that we dare put this topic on the table.
It's interesting, at first there was some suspicion about Molina's, Otto Perez's motivations. That certainly aid from the US is going to go down for the military and so forth in the drug war. Some wondered whether he was using it as a bargaining chip, but that doesn't seem to be the case now, and it's quite specific. And this isn't simply about the framework. I mean, he's being very careful there. This isn't part of that usual framework of either you have legalization or you have prohibition. There's something a bit more complicated going on, Jose Cardenas. Would you agree with the statements that he's making there?
I think it's time that we indeed join together with our partners in the hemisphere for a serious discussion. I think that in an environment like that, we can put on the table arguments pro and con. I believe, in my opinion, that when you look at the data, when you look at the hard facts, I do not believe that the policy choices that are inevitable from that are liberalizing access to drugs within these societies. I do believe, however, that what these leaders have to recognize is that the United States has its own red lines in this debate. There is no American politician that's going to get reelected on a decriminalization platform. Especially this president, in an election year, he went about as far as he could in making comments about the drug debate at the summit.
Right, but then, say, Stephen Dudley, there's that sense then that without U.S. leadership, the region has to move alone. I mean, is that possible? Let's again begin at the beginning, though. What exactly are people asking for as they ask for change?
I think they're asking for the ability to try certain things, to try new things.
Specifically what, though?
Specifically, I'm thinking most of them are talking about decriminalizing to start out with. Now, certainly that takes off certain pressures on certain institutions, specifically their prison systems, that they're very worried about. They're overcrowded. They're having a lot of trouble controlling those prison systems. So that's sort of one element of it. But you have to separate that from the idea of legalization, which is much more complicated. And then within legalization, you've got to separate the substances themselves. So you're talking about a multi-layered discussion. So to talk blanketly, as he does about legalization, I think is silly. That is not the place to start. I think you have to start very specific, and I think you can start unilaterally, or at least bilaterally, or trying to form some sort of small coalitions. You're not going to get a regional consensus on this, but you are going to get experiments, and from those experiments, you're going to be able to judge how much this is going to work.
But Lara Gill, what's the goal? I guess that's the other starting point there. What are we trying to achieve exactly through a change in policy?
I think decriminalization will solve the problem of drugs for the developed world. It will incorporate then, if there is the decriminalization of consumption, there will be then a public health approach to the issue of drug consumption. That's very fine. That's good. But it's not enough for Latin America. It's not enough because our problem is that we have a political structure permeated by the corruption that's brought in by the drug cartels. We have a problem of violence that will not be solved by decriminalizing. So Latin American states need to think beyond decriminalization.
But I mean, again, to return to this idea of what we're trying to achieve there, I mean, Jose Cardenas, you say Plan Colombia was a great success, and yet 95% of the cocaine on American streets is from Colombia. How can that be seen as a success from even from Washington's point of view?
Well, I think that the numbers will show that that the situation is never stagnant. It's never fixed. It's constant. One of the problems is it's constantly moving around. And the goals are elusive, because once you start pressing down in one area, of course, as we know, they pop up in other places. But I do believe that when you take a holistic approach, it's not just a military approach, but you're talking about complete administrative reforms. As Stephen mentioned, the penal system, the justice system. You have to go from A to Z in helping these countries boost their capabilities.
Right, but the U.S. isn't prepared to go down this route. So how do these countries in Central America achieve this without U.S. help, with the demand still going strong, and indeed perhaps outright hostility from the U.S. to any policies of decriminalization and administrative reform?
They do it the way they're trying to do it now. It's essentially they're doing it on their own. Even the small amount of aid that the United States is giving isn't necessarily making a difference. Just take the example of Mexico. United States aid to Mexico, the Merida Initiative, the vaunted Merida Initiative, represents a paltry sum. If it's $400 million per year, and the security budget in Mexico is over $10 billion per year, that is a drop in the bucket for what that country needs in order to fight organized crime. And so it is not necessarily the money. It is not a money issue. We've got to move beyond that question of a money issue.
Right, but do you think the US, though, if more and more countries in Central America start going down this route, might they not simply not say anything? They might actually start standing in the way. I mean, of decriminalization and legalization and so forth. Might they not be slapping on sanctions? Might they not become outright hostile? Partly because of all the political forces here in Washington who want to keep the war on drugs going because it's so profitable for a start as well.
Well, it would be distressing, really, to see such a divergence of interests between the United States and its neighbors. I do believe that that one of the things that we haven't spoken about and is really the elephant in the living room, and that is demand from the United States. It is our consumption, and that is what's partly fueling this great frustration and this surging debate, is that a lot of these countries, as Stephen said, that they're stacking up their dead in the war against drugs, all for the benefit of casual drug use in the United States. And what the United States, we need to go back to very, very strong efforts to educate the public about the cost of our casual drug use in the United States.
You really think that's going to make a difference as to whether someone does a line of code?
I think if we link it to the terrorism issue, if people know that every time that they're engaging in this activity, they're putting money into terrorists' treasuries, I think we may be able to
Larragill, the other argument against decriminalization and some of these other arguments we're hearing is it probably won't do anything to reduce violence in the end. Organized crime would still exist. And actually, that's probably, it's a myth, is what we often hear. I mean, you're not going to get rid of violence simply through decriminalization and further liberalization. What would you say to that?
I would say that we won't get rid of violence if we move only towards decriminalization. If we move towards a regulated market by the state, I think we will take away the power of the drug cartels.
Stephen Dudley, then, I mean, this still sounds a bit general there. I mean, are we really going to see real movement in Guatemala, for example, or any of these other countries, as far as you can see, for a regulated market?
I think what you're going to see is a sort of reallocation of resources. I think that the priorities that came from the North, so to say, that came from the United States, where they said, what we need is you to eliminate this kingpin, and this kingpin. It will change to the priorities of that local country saying, the most violent crime group is X. Therefore, we are going to allocate 98% of our resources to fight X, to lower the violence. And these are the types of reallocations you're going to see. Those are going to be two different priority sets. And the local government is going to begin to take their own decisions because they're no longer receiving this amount of aid that makes them have this dependency. So you'll see them begin to take
Larragill,
decisions.
where will we see this change start happening, and what sort of time frame are we talking about, do you think, if you do believe this?
No, we're talking a longer time frame. I mean, we're not talking short term here, but what I see is a region that is moving away from the United States and a White House and a political class in the United States that is deaf to what Latin America is saying. The divergence of interest is already there, and what Jose calls the elephant in the room. Let me tell you, in 1986, Colombia began talking about a shared responsibility, the shared responsibility between producers and consumers. And where are we now? We are putting the dead.
Jose Cardenas, can you see any real discussion in Washington? Actually, we've only got 30 seconds. Hillary Clinton a few years ago seemed to admit that the drug war had been a failure. Now we've got all the Obama administration officials on emergency missions to Latin America saying, hang on, keep doing it, it's going very well. What's going on in the administration in 30 seconds? As far as you
well, I believe we need we do need a very extreme course correction in getting back involved with our neighbors.
But is that simply to flood the region with weapons again there? I mean,
no, I believe it is. We have an agenda. What we need to do is create an agenda that helps these countries deal with public security and help
that sounds weapons again though, doesn't it?
But help them develop the capacity to repress criminals and keep them.
But who else will be repressed? I guess that's a whole different topic. Jose Cardenas, Larragill, very quickly.
The judicial system. We need to work on the judicial system, and we need to work on a proportional system of punishment, of sentences for drug dealers and those involved in violent crimes. It's actually quite offensive to see that drug dealers that are extradited to the United States pay minor sentences in the United States. They stay very little time in jail. They are free. They come back to Colombia to enjoy their money, while we have here peasants in jail for planting coca plants.
Lara Gill, thank you very much. Stephen Dudley, thank you. Jose Cardenas, thank you very much as well.
Thank you. Thanks.
That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program.